When did a teacher watch a student get beaten unconscious and keep eating her lunch? I was sitting 3 rows back in Mrs. Vance's substitute English class when Kyle Brennan threw the first punch at Aaron Diaz. It was a Friday in November, the kind of gray afternoon where everyone's just counting down minutes until the weekend. Mrs. Vance had arrived that morning with a rolling suitcase and a Tupperware container of pasta salad, announcing she'd be covering for our regular teacher, Mr. Hutchinson, who was out for medical leave. She didn't introduce herself beyond writing her name on the board, didn't ask our names, didn't even look up from her phone while taking attendance by just saying, "Here," for everyone, whether they responded or not. The first 40 minutes of class had been silent reading time, which really meant everyone was on their phones while she sat at the desk eating her lunch and watching something on her laptop with earbuds in. I was actually reading because I'd gotten into the book, some thriller about a girl who witnesses a crime, when I heard Kyle's voice cut through the quiet classroom with that particular edge that meant trouble was coming. Aaron had been sitting 2 seats ahead of me, hunched over his desk trying to finish homework for another class. Kyle and his 2 friends, Nathan and Derek, had been throwing paper balls at the back of Aaron's head for the past 10 minutes. Small stuff at first, then harder, trying to get a reaction. Aaron kept ignoring them, which only made Kyle more determined. I watched Mrs. Vance glance up once when a paper ball bounced off Aaron's shoulder, saw her eyes track the situation for maybe 2 seconds before she went back to her pasta salad, stabbing a cherry tomato with her plastic fork. Kyle stood up then, walked over to Aaron's desk, and swept all his papers onto the floor in one dramatic motion. The sound of textbooks and notebooks hitting linoleum echoed through the classroom, and everyone looked up. Aaron's jaw tightened, but he just bent down to pick up his stuff without saying anything. That's when Kyle grabbed the back of Aaron's collar and yanked him upward so hard I heard fabric ripping. "You think you're too good to respond when I'm talking to you?" Kyle said, his voice loud enough that there was no way Mrs. Vance didn't hear him. I looked at the front of the room, and Mrs. Vance was still eating, her eyes fixed on her laptop screen. She had to see what was happening because Kyle and Aaron were maybe 15 feet from her desk, right in her line of sight. Aaron tried to pull away, but Kyle shoved him backward into the desk. The metal legs scraped against the floor with this horrible screeching sound that made my teeth hurt. Nathan and Derek were laughing now. That cruel hyena sound that bullies make when they know they're winning. Aaron's face was red, his hands balled into fists at his sides, and I could see him deciding whether to fight back or keep trying to de-escalate. "Mrs. Vance!" I called out, my voice cracking a little because I wasn't used to speaking up in class. She didn't respond, didn't even look up, just kept chewing her pasta with this distant expression like she was watching a show she'd seen before and wasn't particularly invested in. Kyle grabbed Aaron's shirt again, this time with both hands, pulling him face to face. "You're gonna apologize for disrespecting me," Kyle said, and Aaron finally snapped back that Kyle was the one disrespecting everyone by being an asshole. That's when Kyle punched him. Not a shove or a slap, but a real punch, his fist connecting with Aaron's jaw with a crack that made several girls in the front row gasp. Aaron stumbled backward, his hand going to his face, and I saw blood starting to drip from his lip. The classroom erupted in noise, people yelling, chairs scraping as students stood up to get a better view or back away from the violence. Mrs. Vance looked up then. Finally, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. She made eye contact with Kyle, who was advancing on Aaron again, his fists still raised. Then she looked back down at her laptop and took another bite of pasta. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. A student had just been punched in the face, was bleeding, and the adult in the room who was supposed to stop this was literally eating lunch like nothing was happening. Aaron tried to put his hands up in a defensive position, but Kyle was bigger, angrier, had 2 friends backing him up. He hit Aaron again, this time in the stomach, and Aaron doubled over with a sound like all the air being forced out of his lungs. Nathan kicked Aaron's legs out from under him, and he went down hard, his head bouncing off the floor with a thud that made my stomach turn. Kyle started kicking Aaron while he was on the ground. Not wild kicks, but deliberate, focused on his ribs, his back, his head. Aaron tried to curl into a ball, his arms over his face. But 3 against 1 when you're already down doesn't leave many defensive options. The sound of shoes hitting flesh and bone mixed with Aaron's grunts of pain and the screaming of other students. Someone yelled to call 911. Another person ran toward the door, but Derek blocked it, standing in front of the exit with his arms crossed like this was all some kind of game. I looked at Mrs. Vance again, and she was scrolling on her laptop now, using one hand to eat while the other clicked her trackpad. Her face was completely neutral, like she was checking her email or shopping online while a student was being beaten 6 feet away from her. I stood up without really deciding to, my book falling to the floor. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I walked toward the front of the room, toward Mrs. Vance's desk, because surely if I got her attention directly, made her look at what was happening, she'd have to do something. "Mrs. Vance," I said when I reached her desk, trying to keep my voice steady even though I felt like I might throw up. "You need to stop this right now. A student is getting hurt." She looked up at me then, and her expression wasn't alarmed or concerned or guilty. It was annoyed, like I was interrupting something important. "Sit down," she said, her voice flat and cold. "This is between them. Boys will work it out." Behind me, Aaron had stopped moving. He was just lying there on the floor in a heap while Kyle kicked him one more time in the ribs. The classroom had gone quieter, that horrible silence where everyone knows something is really, really wrong, but doesn't know what to do about it. Blood was pooling under Aaron's head, spreading across the tan linoleum in a dark red circle that kept getting bigger. His eyes were closed and his face was this grayish color that didn't look human. Nathan and Derek were backing away now, their faces showing the first signs of fear as they realized this had gone too far. Kyle stood over Aaron breathing hard, his knuckles bloody, and even he looked uncertain, like he hadn't meant to go this far but didn't know how to stop once he'd started. I pulled out my phone and started dialing 911, but Mrs. Vance stood up so fast, her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. She crossed the space between us in 2 strides and grabbed my phone out of my hand before I could even finish entering the numbers. "No phones during class," she said, slipping my phone into her pocket. "That's an automatic detention." I stared at her, my brain unable to process that she'd just confiscated my phone while a student was unconscious and bleeding on her classroom floor. "He needs an ambulance," I said, and my voice came out louder than I meant it to, almost a yell. "He's not moving. He might be dying." Mrs. Vance glanced over at Aaron's motionless body, then back at me. "He's fine," she said. "Probably just got the wind knocked out of him." Boys are dramatic. But Aaron wasn't moving at all, wasn't even breathing that I could see, and the blood pool was still spreading. A girl named Michelle had her phone out and was filming everything, her hands shaking so badly the video was probably unwatchable. Mrs. Vance saw her and held out her hand. "Phone," she demanded. Michelle hesitated, then slowly handed it over, and Mrs. Vance added it to her collection. The classroom door burst open, and Mr. Reeves from the math class next door ran in, having heard the commotion through the walls. He took one look at Aaron on the floor and immediately dropped to his knees next to him, checking for a pulse. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, then looked up at Mrs. Vance. "Did you call for help?" She was sitting back down at her desk, picking up her fork again like Mr. Reeves's arrival was just another interruption. "The situation was under control," she said. Mr. Reeves stared at her with an expression I'd never seen on a teacher's face before, pure rage mixed with disbelief. "Under control," he repeated. "This kid isn't breathing properly. Call 911 right now." Mrs. Vance took another bite of pasta salad. "I'm not calling anyone. These boys need to learn to handle their own problems without adults solving everything for them." Mr. Reeves pulled out his own phone and made the call himself, speaking rapidly to the dispatcher while keeping 2 fingers on Aaron's neck to monitor his pulse. He told Kyle and his friends not to move, told the rest of us to stay in our seats, told Mrs. Vance she needed to leave the room immediately until administration arrived. She didn't leave, just kept eating. The next 10 minutes felt like hours. Mr. Reeves stayed with Aaron, talking to him even though Aaron wasn't responding, telling him help was coming and he needed to hang on. Aaron's breathing was shallow and raspy, this horrible wet sound that meant blood or fluid in his lungs or something equally bad that I didn't have medical knowledge to understand. Other students were crying, some calling their parents, everyone in shock at what we'd just witnessed. Kyle had sunk into a desk in the back corner, his face in his hands, while Nathan and Derek stood frozen like they'd been turned to stone. Mrs. Vance finished her pasta salad, closed the Tupperware container, and pulled out a granola bar from her purse. She unwrapped it slowly, took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. It was the most surreal thing I'd ever seen, watching an adult eat a snack while a child she was responsible for lay bleeding and unconscious on the floor. When paramedics finally burst through the door with their equipment and their urgent voices, Mrs. Vance looked almost irritated at the disruption, like we were all overreacting to something minor. The paramedics worked fast, checking Aaron's vitals, stabilizing his neck, getting him onto a backboard and then a stretcher. One of them asked Mr. Reeves what happened, and he gave a rapid summary while shooting dark looks at Mrs. Vance, who was now checking her phone like none of this concerned her. The lead paramedic asked how long Aaron had been unconscious, and Mr. Reeves said at least 15 minutes, maybe 20. The paramedic's face tightened, and he spoke into his radio about possible traumatic brain injury and the need for immediate transport to County General's Trauma Center. They wheeled Aaron out on the stretcher, an oxygen mask over his face, his body completely limp, and the classroom felt empty without him, even though all of us were still there. Principal Whitmore arrived right as the paramedics were leaving, followed by 2 police officers. He stood in the doorway taking in the scene, the blood on the floor, the crying students, Kyle and his friends huddled together, Mr. Reeves looking like he wanted to punch someone, and Mrs. Vance calmly eating a granola bar at the teacher's desk. Principal Whitmore's face went through several emotions in quick succession: confusion, shock, anger, before settling on grim professional concern. He asked Mr. Reeves to explain what happened, and Mr. Reeves did, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. He explained how he'd heard screaming through the wall, how he'd found Aaron unconscious and bleeding with Mrs. Vance sitting at her desk eating lunch, how she'd refused to call for help and had confiscated students' phones when they tried to call themselves. The police officers were taking notes, their expressions darkening as the story unfolded. Principal Whitmore turned to Mrs. Vance with this look that could have frozen fire. "Is this accurate?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Mrs. Vance shrugged, finishing the last bite of her granola bar and crumpling the wrapper. Boys got into a fight, she said. I don't believe in coddling teenagers by jumping in at the first sign of conflict. They need to learn natural consequences. The room went silent. Even the police officers looked stunned. Principal Whitmore's jaw muscles were working like he was physically restraining himself from yelling. One of the officers, a woman with graying hair and sergeant stripes, stepped forward. Ma'am, you witnessed an assault of a minor and failed to render aid or call for assistance? Mrs. Vance looked at her with this condescending smile. I witnessed a scuffle between boys who've probably been antagonizing each other for months. The one on the floor was clearly faking unconsciousness to get the other one in trouble. Kids these days are masters of manipulation. The sergeant exchanged a glance with her partner, and something passed between them that made my stomach drop. This wasn't just going to be a school discipline issue. This was criminal. The sergeant asked Mrs. Vance for her identification and teaching credentials. Mrs. Vance pulled out her wallet slowly, like she was doing them a favor, and handed over her driver's license. The sergeant looked at it, then at her partner, then back at Mrs. Vance. You're not a certified teacher, she said, and it wasn't a question. Mrs. Vance stiffened slightly. I'm a substitute. I don't need the same credentials as full-time staff. Principal Whitmore's face was now completely white. All substitutes in this district are required to complete a background check and emergency response training, he said, his voice tight. Where are your clearance documents? The room held its breath while Mrs. Vance dug through her purse, pulling out crumpled papers and finally producing a folder. She handed it to Principal Whitmore, who flipped through it with increasing agitation. These clearances expired 2 years ago, he said quietly. How did you get approved to work today? Mrs. Vance crossed her arms defensively. The substitute coordinator called me this morning saying they were desperate for coverage. I assumed my paperwork was in order. Principal Whitmore looked like he might be sick. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone at the district office. While he was on the phone, the other officer approached Kyle, Nathan, and Derek, who were still frozen in the back of the room. He read them their rights in that flat official voice cops use, and all 3 boys started crying. Kyle was repeating, I didn't mean to, over and over, while Nathan and Derek tried to explain how it was supposed to be just a joke, just messing around. They didn't think anyone would get seriously hurt. The officer wasn't sympathetic, just methodical, getting their statements while his partner did the same with Mrs. Vance. I gave my statement to the sergeant while sitting at a desk with my hands shaking so badly I had to sit on them. I explained how the fight started, how Kyle had punched Aaron first, how Mrs. Vance had watched the whole thing while eating lunch and refused to help when multiple students begged her to intervene. The sergeant asked if I was sure Mrs. Vance had seen what was happening, and I said yes, absolutely. She'd looked directly at Kyle hitting Aaron and then gone back to her food. The sergeant made detailed notes, asking for specifics about timing, about exactly what Mrs. Vance had said and done, about the other students who could corroborate my account. Michelle mentioned she'd been filming until Mrs. Vance took her phone, and the sergeant's eyes lit up. We'll need to retrieve that phone as evidence, she said. And Mrs. Vance actually tried to argue that student phones were school property during class hours. The sergeant informed her that was absolutely not how property law worked, and she needed to hand over all confiscated devices immediately. Mrs. Vance reluctantly pulled out 4 phones from her pockets and bag, laying them on the desk like cards in a poker game she knew she was losing. Mr. Reeves was giving his statement to the other officer, explaining in clinical detail exactly what he'd observed when he entered the room. He described Aaron's condition, the amount of blood, Mrs. Vance's complete lack of response, her active interference when students tried to call for help. His voice kept breaking with emotion, and he had to pause several times to compose himself. The officer asked if he'd ever witnessed anything concerning about Mrs. Vance before, and Mr. Reeves said this was the first time he'd seen her at this school, that he hadn't even known we had a substitute today until he heard the commotion. Principal Whitmore finished his phone call, looking even more disturbed than before. He pulled the sergeant aside and they spoke in low voices, both of them glancing at Mrs. Vance periodically. Finally, the sergeant approached Mrs. Vance with a formal stiffness that made everyone in the room pay attention. Ma'am, you're being detained for questioning regarding failure to render aid, child endangerment, and obstruction of emergency services. You have the right to remain silent. Mrs. Vance's face finally showed emotion, shock, and outrage mixing into this ugly expression. You can't arrest me for not getting involved in a fight between teenagers, she protested. I'm not a security guard. I'm not responsible for their violence. The sergeant's voice remained calm and professional. You were the supervising adult in this classroom. You had a legal duty to protect the minors in your care and to seek emergency assistance when one was injured. Instead, you actively prevented others from getting help while a child lost consciousness from a head injury. That's not a disciplinary matter, ma'am. That's a criminal matter. Mrs. Vance looked around the room like she expected someone to defend her, to tell the police they were overreacting. But every student was staring at her with varying degrees of horror and disgust. Mr. Reeves looked like he wanted to spit on her. Principal Whitmore had his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. The sergeant's partner produced handcuffs, and Mrs. Vance's protests got louder and more frantic. This is insane. I'll lose my ability to work in schools. You're ruining my career over boys being boys. The handcuffs clicked into place, and Mrs. Vance was led out of the classroom still arguing, her voice echoing down the hallway until it faded into distance. The rest of us sat in stunned silence, unable to process what we'd just witnessed. It felt surreal, like something from a TV show rather than real life at our actual school. Principal Whitmore cleared his throat and addressed the class in a voice that tried for calm but couldn't quite get there. Everyone needs to go to the library immediately. Your parents are being called to pick you up early. There will be counselors available to talk to anyone who needs support. We filed out slowly. Nobody talking, everybody looking shell-shocked. I saw blood still on the floor where Aaron had been lying, being careful to step around it. The police had cordoned off the area with that yellow tape you see in crime dramas, making our English classroom officially a crime scene. At the library, we sat scattered at tables, most people on their phones texting parents or scrolling through social media where the story was already starting to spread. Michelle had gotten her phone back and immediately uploaded the video she'd recorded to a private Instagram account. But within an hour, it had been screenshotted and shared dozens of times. The video was worse than I remembered. Watching it from Michelle's perspective in the front row, you could see everything clearly. Kyle's first punch connecting with Aaron's face. Aaron going down. The sustained beating while he was on the ground. And in the background, perfectly framed, Mrs. Vance sitting at the teacher's desk with her lunch container open, taking bites of pasta salad while occasionally glancing up at the violence with what could only be described as mild interest. The video captured the moment I approached her desk, though you couldn't hear what we said, only see her take my phone and pocket it while Aaron lay motionless behind us. The comment section was already filling with outrage, people demanding to know what school this was, calling for Mrs. Vance to be arrested, sharing their own stories about negligent teachers who'd failed to protect students. The video was getting thousands of views per hour, and several news outlets had already reached out to students for interviews. My mom arrived at the library 30 minutes later, looking terrified, pulling me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. She'd gotten the robocall from the school explaining there'd been a serious incident, and students needed immediate pickup. In the car, I explained everything while she drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She kept saying, "Oh my God," and "That's insane," and "How could she just sit there?" When I got to the part about Mrs. Vance confiscating phones when students tried to call 911, my mom actually had to pull over because her hands were shaking too badly to drive safely. We sat in a parking lot while she processed, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, fear. Finally, she asked if I was okay, and I realized I didn't actually know. I felt numb, disconnected, like this had happened to someone else, and I'd just been watching. The rest of the weekend was a blur of phone calls and news reports. Aaron was in intensive care at County General with a severe concussion, fractured skull, broken ribs, and a punctured lung. The doctors said he was stable, but wouldn't know the full extent of brain damage until he woke up. His parents released a statement through their lawyer, saying they were pursuing both criminal and civil action against everyone involved, including the school district for hiring an unauthorized substitute. Kyle, Nathan, and Derek were all charged with assault and battery of a minor. Their arraignments were scheduled for Monday morning, and local news was camped outside their houses getting footage of their families looking devastated. Mrs. Vance, whose full name was revealed to be Lorraine Vance, became the focus of national outrage when Michelle's video went fully viral. Within 48 hours, it had 15 million views across various platforms. Every news outlet from local stations to CNN was running the story of the substitute teacher who ate lunch while watching a student get beaten unconscious. Reporters dug into her background and found she'd been fired from 2 previous substitute positions in other districts for similar failures to supervise students properly, though nothing as severe as this. She'd lied on her application to the substitute coordinator about her clearances being current, forging documents that said she'd completed training she'd never actually attended. The district's substitute coordinator was placed on administrative leave pending investigation into how Vance had slipped through the vetting process. Parents were demanding accountability, flooding school board meetings, starting petitions, organizing protests. A group of mothers set up camp outside the district office with signs reading, "Our kids deserve protection," and "Fire everyone responsible." The superintendent called an emergency press conference Friday evening, looking like he'd aged a decade in 24 hours. He read from a prepared statement explaining that Lorraine Vance had never been a properly credentialed substitute, that she'd committed fraud to obtain the position, that the district was implementing immediate reforms to the substitute hiring process, including real-time credential verification and enhanced background checks. He announced that Principal Whitmore would be placed on administrative leave while they investigated how the failure occurred at the school level. Parents in the audience started yelling questions, demanding to know how many other uncertified substitutes were currently working in district schools, whether their children were safe, why it took a child nearly dying for these reforms to be implemented. The superintendent tried to maintain control but eventually just walked off stage while reporters shouted questions at his back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Aaron on the floor in that spreading pool of blood, his body completely still. I kept thinking about how easily that could have been me or any of my friends, how we'd been in a room with someone who was supposed to protect us, but instead had actively chosen to let harm continue. My parents let me sleep in their bed that night like I was a little kid again, and I wasn't embarrassed about it because I needed to be somewhere that felt safe. Monday morning, the school district announced all classes were canceled for the week while they conducted a comprehensive review of safety protocols. This only made parents angrier because now they had to scramble for childcare while the district tried to cover their asses. A lawyer named Patricia Keene held a press conference representing Aaron's family, standing with his parents who looked absolutely destroyed. Aaron's mother could barely speak, breaking down in tears while describing her son's injuries and the long recovery ahead. Aaron had woken up over the weekend but wasn't fully coherent yet, couldn't remember the attack, kept asking why his head hurt so badly. The doctors were cautiously optimistic but warned there might be permanent cognitive effects from the brain injury. Patricia Keene laid out the lawsuit in scathing detail, naming Lorraine Vance, Principal Whitmore, the substitute coordinator, the superintendent, and the school district itself. She explained they were seeking $10 million in damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and the district's systemic failures that put profit over student safety. She revealed that the district had been warned repeatedly about inadequate substitute vetting, but had ignored those warnings to save money on the verification process. The criminal case against Lorraine Vance moved forward with shocking speed. The district attorney personally took the case, charging her with child endangerment, failure to render aid, obstruction of justice, and fraud for falsifying her credentials. Her bail was set at $100,000, which she couldn't make, so she sat in county jail awaiting trial. Her public defender tried to argue she was being made a scapegoat for systemic failures, that she'd had no training on emergency response because the district never provided it, that she genuinely believed the boys were just roughhousing. But Michelle's video made that defense impossible. You could see on camera the moment Mrs. Vance looked directly at Aaron bleeding on the floor and then deliberately turned back to her lunch. No amount of spin could explain that away. Kyle, Nathan, and Derek took plea deals after their lawyers saw the video evidence and witness statements. Kyle was charged as an adult given the severity of Aaron's injuries and took a deal for 8 years in juvenile detention followed by probation. Nathan and Derek got 6 years each. All three would have felony records for the rest of their lives. Their families released statements about how their sons had made terrible mistakes and they were praying for Aaron's recovery. But social media was merciless, doxing them, harassing them, making sure everyone knew what they'd done. The school board held a special meeting in late November that had to be moved to the high school auditorium because over 500 parents showed up. I went with my parents and sat in the back, watching as parent after parent approached the microphone to share their outrage. One mother described how her daughter had been assaulted in a bathroom last year, and the principal had discouraged her from filing a police report because it would hurt the school's reputation. Another father talked about his son being bullied so severely he'd attempted suicide, and when he tried to get help from administration, he'd been told boys needed to learn to be tough. Pattern after pattern emerged of the district prioritizing metrics and reputation over student safety. The board members sat stone-faced through 3 hours of testimony, offering nothing but scripted apologies that satisfied no one. Finally, a woman named Diana Torres stood up and announced she was running for school board in the next election on a platform of complete administrative overhaul. The auditorium erupted in applause. By the end of the week, 6 other parents had announced their candidacy as well, all on reform platforms. The current board was going to be swept out entirely. Principal Whitmore's investigation concluded with his termination for gross negligence in supervising substitute hiring and failure to ensure proper credentialing. He tried to argue he'd relied on the substitute coordinator to verify credentials and wasn't personally responsible for the oversight failure, but the board ruled that as principal, the buck stopped with him. The substitute coordinator was also fired and faced potential criminal charges for fraud, given her role in approving Vance despite expired clearances. 4 other administrators were demoted or transferred for their roles in creating the culture of negligence. The district hired an outside consulting firm to do a complete audit of safety procedures, and their report was damning. They found that over 40% of current substitutes had expired clearances that no one had checked, that emergency response training hadn't been updated in 8 years, that incident reports were routinely filed away without investigation, that the system prioritized keeping problems quiet over actually solving them. The report's recommendations filled 150 pages and would cost millions to implement properly. Parents demanded every single recommendation be adopted immediately regardless of cost. I went back to school in December when classes finally resumed, and everything felt different. The new principal was a woman named Dr. Sheffield, who'd come from a district known for progressive safety policies. She held assemblies where she actually listened to student concerns, instead of lecturing us about respect and responsibility. She implemented open-door policies where any student could report concerns anonymously, without fear of retaliation. She brought in counselors to do classroom visits about processing trauma and recognizing when adults were failing their duties. Our English class had to be moved to a different room because too many students couldn't handle being in the space where Aaron had nearly died. They'd cleaned the blood from the floor and repainted the walls, but everyone could still see it, still feel the wrongness of that room. Aaron didn't come back that semester. He was doing physical therapy and cognitive rehabilitation, relearning things the brain injury had damaged. Oilia, who was his girlfriend, visited him every day after school and told us he was getting better slowly, remembering more, but he still had terrible headaches and sometimes forgot words mid-sentence or got confused about where he was. Lorraine Vance's trial happened in February and lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented Michelle's video, which was played repeatedly for the jury, along with testimony from over a dozen students who'd been in the classroom. Mr. Reeves testified about what he'd found when he entered the room and his shock at Mrs. Vance's complete lack of concern. The medical examiner explained in detail Aaron's injuries and how the delay in treatment had worsened his prognosis. Mrs. Vance's defense attorney tried to argue she'd been inadequately trained and didn't understand the severity of the situation, but the prosecution demolished that by showing she'd actively prevented students from calling for help, confiscating phones, and threatening detention. That went beyond ignorance into willful negligence. On cross-examination, the prosecutor asked Mrs. Vance directly why she'd continued eating lunch while a student lay bleeding and unconscious. Her answer made the jury visibly recoil. "I've dealt with teenagers for 15 years, she said, her voice cold and certain. They're masters of manipulation and fake drama. I thought he was pretending to be hurt worse than he was to get the other boys in trouble." The prosecutor let that statement hang in the air for a long moment before asking his next question. "Even when he stopped moving entirely? Even when the pool of blood under his head kept getting bigger? Even when other students were crying and begging you to call for help?" Mrs. Vance's face tightened. "Yes," she said. "I've seen students fake seizures, fake asthma attacks, fake everything imaginable to get attention or get out of class. I was not going to reward that behavior." The prosecutor played the video again, this time with timestamps highlighted. He pointed out the 47-second mark where you could see Aaron's body go completely limp, the 2-minute mark where blood first became visible on the floor, the 4-minute mark where multiple students approached Mrs. Vance's desk clearly in distress, the 6-minute mark where I tried to call 911 and she confiscated my phone. Through all of it, in the background of the video, Mrs. Vance sat eating her lunch with no visible concern. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Mrs. Vance showed no emotion when the verdicts were read, just stared straight ahead like she was somewhere else entirely. At sentencing 3 weeks later, the judge was harsh. He noted that as an educator, Mrs. Vance had held a position of trust and responsibility that she'd betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. He sentenced her to 8 years in state prison with no possibility of parole before 5 years served. Aaron came back to school in April, walking with a slight limp from where his ribs had healed improperly and still wearing a medical alert bracelet in case he had seizures, which were now a permanent risk from the brain injury. The whole school knew his story, had seen the viral video, understood what he'd survived. People treated him differently now, with a weird mixture of reverence and discomfort, like he was a living reminder of how badly things could go wrong. He didn't talk much about what happened, said he still couldn't remember most of the actual beating, just fragments. Waking up in the hospital weeks later, learning he'd nearly died, finding out his attackers were in prison, and the teacher who'd watched it happen was too. In May, the school district settled the lawsuit with Aaron's family for $8.5 million, which seemed like a lot until you factored in lifetime medical care for brain injury complications, lost educational opportunities, and the trauma of knowing adults had chosen to let him be beaten nearly to death. The settlement also required the district to establish a $2 million fund for other students harmed by administrative negligence and to implement every single recommendation from the safety audit. Kyle's family tried to sue the district too, arguing that proper supervision would have prevented their son from committing assault, but the judge threw it out, stating that the district's failures didn't absolve Kyle of personal responsibility for his violent choices. The new school board was elected in a landslide that November, with Diana Torres becoming board president. She immediately started implementing reforms that went beyond just substitute credentialing. Mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and responding to violence. Student advocacy positions where trained adults served solely as student representatives with no loyalty to administration. Regular safety audits by external firms, parent oversight committees with actual power to investigate concerns, anonymous reporting systems that went directly to law enforcement instead of through school channels that might suppress them. The culture shifted from protecting the institution to protecting the students. And while it wasn't perfect, it was better than before. I graduated that spring with a class that felt marked by what we'd witnessed. At graduation, the principal gave Aaron a special recognition for resilience and courage, but Aaron barely smiled when he accepted it. I don't think any award or recognition could make up for what he'd lost. The brain function that would never fully return, the trauma that would need years of therapy, the knowledge that adults had failed him so completely. In my valedictorian speech, I talked about the responsibility we all had to speak up when we saw injustice, even when authority figures told us to be quiet, even when it felt easier to look away. I went to college that fall planning to study education policy, wanting to understand the systems that had failed so spectacularly and how to fix them. Aaron went to community college, his brain injury making a traditional 4-year program too challenging. Michelle became a criminal justice major, driven by what she'd witnessed and documented. Mr. Reeves quit teaching, telling friends he couldn't stay in a profession that had become so toxic and bureaucratic that a child's life mattered less than avoiding liability. I stayed in touch with Aaron through social media, watching him slowly build a new normal life around his limitations. He posted about his therapy sessions, his small victories like remembering a whole conversation or going a week without seizures, his ongoing legal battles with the families of his attackers who kept trying to reduce their sentences. 5 years after the incident, I was doing research for my master's thesis on institutional failure in education when I came across a news article. Lorraine Vance had been released early from prison for good behavior after serving 6 years of her 8-year sentence. She'd moved to a different state and was reportedly working in retail, forbidden from ever working with children again. The article included quotes from education experts about how the case had changed substitute teacher requirements nationwide, how districts now had much stricter protocols for credential verification and emergency response. But the experts missed what felt most important to me. The system had only changed because a child nearly died, and because students had video evidence that couldn't be denied or suppressed. Without Michelle's recording, without our collective testimony, without the viral outrage, how many people would have just accepted the official explanation that it was a tragic fight between boys and unfortunate timing? How many other Aaron Diazes were there in classrooms across the country where no one was recording, where administrators successfully covered up failures, where students who spoke up were dismissed as troublemakers? I interviewed Aaron for my thesis, asking him to reflect on the long-term impacts of what happened. He told me the brain injury had taken things from him he'd never get back, certain types of memory formation, ability to process complex information quickly, parts of his personality that had been damaged along with his neurons. But he also said the experience had taught him that authority wasn't the same as wisdom, that adults could be fundamentally wrong, that sometimes the system needed to be forced to change because it would never do so voluntarily. He'd become an advocate for school safety reform, speaking at conferences about his experience, pushing for stronger protections for students and real consequences for institutional failures. When I finished my thesis, I sent a copy to Aaron. He called me after reading it, and we talked for over an hour about everything we'd learned, everything we'd lost, everything that had changed because of that Friday in November when he'd been beaten unconscious while a teacher ate her lunch 6 feet away. We talked about Kyle and Nathan and Derek, who would be released from prison in another year or two, their lives permanently marked by the violence they'd committed as teenagers. We talked about Lorraine Vance, who'd never apologized, never shown remorse, had spent her trial insisting she'd done nothing wrong. We talked about the hundreds of thousands of students every day who trusted that the adults in their classrooms would protect them, keep them safe, intervene when violence erupted. And we talked about how that trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired. How every student who witnessed what happened in our classroom that day learned that authority figures might fail them in the worst possible way. Aaron said he still had nightmares sometimes about waking up in the hospital with gaps in his memory and pain everywhere, not understanding what had happened or why no one had helped him. The nightmares were getting less frequent, his therapist said, but probably would never fully stop. We hung up, and I sat with my finished thesis, this academic analysis of systemic failure and institutional reform, and realized it could never capture the full truth of what we'd lived through. The statistics about improved safety protocols and increased credentialing requirements didn't reflect the betrayal of watching an adult choose lunch over a child's life. The policy recommendations couldn't address the fundamental question that still kept me up at night. How many Lorraine Vances were still out there in classrooms? People who'd chosen education not out of calling but convenience, who saw students as problems to be managed rather than people to be protected? The reforms helped, absolutely. Made it harder for the completely unqualified to slip through, made emergency response protocols clearer, gave students more paths to report concerns. But reforms couldn't change human nature, couldn't force someone to care when they fundamentally didn't. 10 years later, I'm a school district safety coordinator, the kind of position that didn't exist before Aaron nearly died, but now every major district has. My job is to audit safety protocols, investigate reported failures, ensure that what happened in our classroom can't happen again. But I know it can, in different forms. In the gaps between policies, in the moments when adults have to choose between convenience and conscience. I visit Aaron once a year on the anniversary of the incident. He's married now, works in IT support, has learned to manage his limitations and build a life around them. We don't talk much about that day anymore, have processed it through years of therapy and conversation and time, but it's always there between us, the knowledge that we survived something that changed the trajectory of our lives completely, that students in our district are safer because Aaron paid the price of becoming a cautionary tale. That Lorraine Vance's name is now used in education programs as the ultimate example of what not to do, how not to be. That Michelle's video is shown in training sessions as evidence of why documentation matters and why student voices must be heard. The reforms were good, necessary, overdue. But they came too late for Aaron, who still has seizures that stop him mid-sentence and has to carry medical alerts everywhere. They came too late for the version of myself who could trust without question that adults in authority would do the right thing. They came too late for everyone who learned that day that safety was an illusion and protection was never guaranteed, no matter how many policies existed on paper. Sometimes people ask me why I chose this career, why I spend my days investigating school safety failures instead of teaching or doing something less depressing. I tell them about a Friday in November when I watched a substitute teacher eat pasta salad while a student bled out on her classroom floor. I tell them about calling 911 and having my phone confiscated, about watching adults fail in every possible way, about learning that the only thing standing between students and harm was often just luck and the courage of their peers. And I tell them that if my job prevents even one student from experiencing what Erin did, from lying on a classroom floor while authority figures choose convenience over compassion, then every difficult investigation and every uncomfortable conversation and every fight with administrators who prioritize reputation over reality will have been worth it. Because that's what we learned that day. Sometimes the only people who will protect students are other students who refuse to look away, refuse to stay silent, refuse to accept that this is just how things are. And sometimes that's enough to force change, even when it shouldn't have to be. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.